I think the essence of leadership now is setting direction, taking other people with you and doing the right thing. And I think actually the things that help us do that, first is to build trust, like deep trust. Second is to build a team or an organizational or a group identity, like who are we and why, what's our purpose and how do we do things around here? And the third thing is around this idea of building a feedback-rich environment. And I think that's what most leaders are starved of, is a community of people who care enough to tell you the kind truth.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Unleashed, the fastest hour on the internet, where every episode I'm joined by a best-selling author or accomplished leader who shares common sense leadership ideas, all in the name of helping you make a greater impact. I'm your host, Jeff Tetz. Most leaders feel their business could perform better. At Results, we help leadership teams achieve their bold visions by providing a unique system of accountability and ongoing coaching to create more predictable and successful outcomes. Reach out for a conversation at unleashresults.com. My guest today is Judy Riege. Judy is an expert in the use of EQ in action assessment, helping clients see themselves under stress, in conflict, and in relationship. And she's one of only 5 practitioners in Canada certified to use the tool to help teams see themselves under stress and conflict. With real-world leadership experience at Frito-Lay Canada, the Fresani Group, and PricewaterhouseCoopers, Judy now works with individuals, teams, and organizations to create clarity, improve connection, build curiosity, and better communicate to create high-performance teams and feedback-rich learning environments. She helps leaders find clarity in who they are, how they show up, and how they can build social and emotional skills. And this is often the difference between good, great, and remarkable. Her work in strategic planning, leadership training, and executive and team coaching across many industries has allowed her to expand and disrupt the habits and practices that are holding people back from their true potential. She is also the proud alumnus of the Richard Ivey School of Business at the University of Western Ontario, holds a certificate in strategic leadership from Queen's University School of Business, a graduate certificate in executive coaching from Royal Roads University, and a certificate in neuroscience through the Neuroscience Academy. Judy, welcome to Unleashed.
Thank you for having me, Jeff. Happy to be here.
Well, and it's such a thrill to have you joining us for a conversation today. And I'm kind of looking at this as bringing a private conversation that you and I had a few months ago into a public conversation. I was so moved by some personal work that you did with me. You've been working with our leadership team now for a few months, and we're going to continue that work. But it resonated with me so deeply that I thought we got to get this recorded so they can hopefully help some of our listeners the way that it had an impact on me. So thanks for joining us.
Right, thanks.
So Judy, you've held a number of leadership positions, and I was wondering, how did you first start becoming familiar with emotional intelligence and its benefits?
Well, I would tell you it's sort of EQ entered my life at a moment that I would call the dark moment of my soul in a leadership role that I was in. At the time, I was rolling out 360-degree feedback programming across the country. At the time, I was working with Frito-Lay Canada. And I decided I better go through the process too. And up until that point in my career, I've had a pretty meteoric rise in bigger and bigger jobs. So I thought I was pretty good in my leadership. And it was actually that 360 that I got almost 20 years ago that changed my life and introduced EQ. And it was really one statement in that 360, if I may. It basically, the statement I got from my staff that was sort of talked to it a few times, but the real one that changed my life was this idea of, I wonder if Judy knows her nickname is Dick, short for dictator. And I'm not going to say that I responded to that particular 360 in a way that I can look back and say I'm really proud of that response. I actually, I won't lie, my first thought was, who said this? And they have to go. And it was a mentor of mine who actually I reached out to first. And anyway, long story short, I started the journey around emotional intelligence with a meeting with my team where they had a copy of my 360. And the meeting started with me saying, who's Dick? I've never met her. What does she say? What does she do? When does she show up? I need you to help me. And that was the beginning of kind of having my behavior made more aware to me, a blind spot or a shadow. And that started the journey down a path of trying to understand what, I was introduced to the concept of emotional intelligence and sort of neuroscience and behavior change around that time. So long story, but that's actually the origin story of kind of what has framed my leadership and now my practice for a couple of decades.
Well, what a brutally honest beginning that is, Judy, not what I was expecting to hear. And I would think that it's more common that folks that would hear that kind of brutally honest feedback would sort of turn the other cheek and sort of ignore it and deflect it. And as you said, maybe go on a hunt for blame and perhaps minimize the source of that feedback. But not only did you receive the feedback well, but you then turned it into a career. What is it about you, looking back, that makes you think you responded so favorably to that brutal honesty?
I think there's two things. One is I'm a competitive person, and I'm driven and ambitious. I guess that would be kind of terms I would sort of put around myself. But the idea that I'm not kind and not caring as part of that mix just wasn't okay for me. And having, up at least in that sort of first decade of my career, some pretty incredible mentors that allowed me to catapult my career and be able to sit in a very senior executive role, to actually have that feedback so early for me was just, it wasn't congruent for me. It wasn't okay. And I've always been fascinated by what makes people tick, because we're kind of messy. And so knowing that I was messy, I figured I needed to figure that piece out first. And so luckily for me, that happened around the same time that, Daniel Goleman's popularizing the whole concept of emotional intelligence in the corporate and the business space. The field of neuroscience is starting to emerge. So all that kind of stuff, I think it all kind of happened at the same time.
And how long was it after that intersection, I guess, of the feedback of who you were versus who you wanted to be, at least for some folks that worked with you, and you leaving the leadership profession to actually become a full-time practitioner? And you're one of only a handful of people in the entire country that's certified to do this work. So how long did it take you before you started kind of venturing out on your own, I guess, to help other people learn from this?
I would say it was another decade, actually, of working in large organizations in kind of senior human resources and leadership development roles before I kind of ventured out on my own. And I actually look back at a lot of that experience as kind of the playground or the practice place. It was like the arenas I got to practice in, And then I think then when I went out on my own, I think a lot of the work I do and what I am able to do with people is I can turn complicated concepts into hopefully simple practices or ideas that allow people to go, okay, I could try that. I could stretch that. I could learn that. And that's what I enjoy doing now.
Judy, there's so much in your own background that you're making me curious, but I think where I'd like to go now is let's talk a little bit specifically about emotional intelligence and what does EQ actually mean? Like, how do you define it?
Okay, great. I mean, it was defined early in the 1990s. But my definition, or the way I sort of position it, is I think emotional intelligence is first my ability to name and notice what I'm thinking and feeling and wanting in a moment. And it's my ability to also be curious and seek to understand what you're thinking and feeling and wanting in a particular moment. So it's this idea of in relationship, and then in surfacing kind of what is invisible to us, it's then being able to, whether as a leader to a staff member or peer member or any relationship, human relationship for that matter, it's that together piece. It's that, so what do we do with this information? And for me, so much of that surfacing what's invisible to make it more visible to me is the beginning of a great conversation. And it's more difficult the more stress or the more conflict or the more challenge there is. And so that's my definition of emotional intelligence. It's in relationship, starts with self-awareness, is combined with other awareness. And at the end of the day, it's really about what's the action plan for how you and I, work, play, partner together.
And what are some of the main reasons that organizations should be paying attention to this?
Oh, wow. There's lots of reasons. I think the biggest one, if we just look at it straight through the leadership lens, right? If you're in a senior leadership role, I mean, there's enough research out there that's going to say that about 85% of us who, where our careers are derailed or we're moved out of a role is largely because we haven't been able to navigate the interpersonal and dynamics of people. So there's that side of things. I also think emotional intelligence more than ever. And one of my favorite articles that emerged actually early on in the pandemic was from Harvard Business Review. And it was Leading at the Speed of Change, which I think was the name of the article. But they introduced a term that I absolutely loved, certainly from someone being, having grown up my leadership career in the HR function, was this idea of sapient leadership. And I fundamentally believe that the future of leadership is how relational we're able to be, and how we're able to create connection and facilitate trust and psychological safety faster than ever, so that we can actually get people working together better towards the results that we need. But if we aren't able to nurture the relationships, I think it's really tough to get things done. And I think we're seeing examples of it. It's tough to attract and retain talent, the Great Resignation, and all those, and the dynamic that we're dealing with around hybrid work. It's here to stay. So how are we leading both in person and virtual communities as leaders? And I think being able to be emotionally intelligent is to care and be aware, should I say, first of ourselves, but how are we creating connection so that people on our teams can contribute in a way that was meaningful and is creating value for our customers and for our colleagues.
You hit on a number of things there, and I know even in the client work that we do, I mean, one of the common themes of the executive teams that we work with on an ongoing basis is that their worlds are changing faster than ever, and it's almost unrelenting, the pace of change, and they're trying to get more done with fewer resources, and fewer resources for lots of different reasons. We'll get into some of that, but anything that's going to help them connect their people faster, to come up with better ideas quicker, and to collaborate in a more effective way. I mean, people should be paying attention to that. I mean, I even came across, there was a 2015 study, Judy, you've probably seen, that concluded that EQ had a strong association with employees speaking up more often and more effectively in the workplace. And you talk about psychological safety. So often we find that there's hidden pockets of talent and capability that largely goes untapped. And so I think that really resonates when I hear you say that. Now, when it comes to like what the components of EQ, I suppose, Judy, what does it consist of?
There's lots of ways. So, if I'm a simplifier, so I'm going to oversimplify this. I think the foundation of emotional intelligence is deep self-awareness first for us as leaders. And the research would say 90% of us think we're very self-aware, but very few of us have systems, practices, or people in our lives, much like I did, 20 years ago, sort of telling me how I was showing up. That kind of says, when we get up in the morning and go about our business and do what we do and say what we say, we're not always aware of kind of the impact, positive or negative, that has. So to me, emotional intelligence first is self-awareness. Second is this idea of empathy or other awareness, empathy and compassion. And to me, the skills that live in that is deep curiosity and a desire to understand. And then the third piece in my little Venn diagram is what I call sort of team or together awareness. So how do we take what you and me and together actually create something? And in a business context or a leadership context, there's usually goals or there's results we're trying to hit. And the metrics that we're measuring that says, okay, this tells us we're commercially smart or we're actually a high-performing team. And I think that's the kind of conversations that emotional intelligent leaders facilitate, is they create more candor and they nurture, or actually they mine for the knowledge and wisdom in the team so that they can make decisions faster to navigate the speed of change we're dealing with.
How much of EQ is a thing that you're born with versus you learn it and develop it?
So I think we're born as emotional creatures because our emotions are significant into the makeup of kind of our experience of life. But emotional intelligence to me is a muscle that we have to build. It's shaped by our lived and learned experiences and the people in it. And for me, emotional intelligence is easy when we're well rested, well fed, and there's no stress in our lives. It's the performing under pressure piece that's going to test, that really tests our emotional intelligence. Like we as a species or as humans, we don't love change. We are hardwired to look for what is wrong or what is threatening versus what is safe. And emotional intelligence is becoming aware of, how do I override my natural, linear, negative, threat-focused way as humans, and looking for, how do I actually create conditions for my best and your best, so that together we actually get better and deliver what we want to do.
I want to come back to how we started the conversation with this brutal feedback that you received about being a dictator. How long did it take you before you were making meaningful change in how you were showing up with your teams?
Right. So I'm not sure I really understood it back then, but I certainly understand the neuroscience now. But it became, I had all these little, I called them games, really, with myself that started to actually help me have changed my habits around my behavior. So it was like, I can't change the way I think, because I didn't fully believe the feedback I got, but I had to trust that it was true. I couldn't see it, right? But I had to trust that when I understood the behaviors of Dick, my former dictator, how did I change that? So I had lots of games. Like, I'll give you some examples if that would help.
Yeah.
I had an acronym, WAIT, WAIT, that was on a Post-it note everywhere in my office at the time, because we didn't have cell phones and all that back then. And WAIT stood for three things for me. Where am I thinking? Why am I talking? And who am I trusting? And so it was this visible cue. So when people came into my office, which was kind of a hub because I was in HR, or my team came in, I had these things as I just had to pause. Like, so the WAIT, also there's power in pause. It's like collecting yourself and taking a breath and going, okay, what's my energy, or where's my thinking? And the idea of where's my thinking was more around, am I open or closed? Now I would sort of use the framework that I learned from Conscious Leadership Group called above or below the line. Because now that, for me, it ties very much to the threat versus safe dynamic of our binary nature of our brains. I had another thing that I was told I was overly critical. I never was appreciative. And so I created a game where I had 10 elastics on one wrist and they had to be on the other wrist by the end of the day. And this wasn't just sort of oh, good job, that was great. I had to actually find 10 meaningful things that were working that I could appreciate that my team was doing. And often in my leadership classes, I asked the question, how long do you think it took me to have my first day where all 10 elastics, were on the other wrist? And, this is a testament to my competitiveness, but it actually took 6 months and 3 days before I had all 10 elastics on the other wrist. It took me that long to find the good. And it just made me, so as somebody who loves to think critically and loves to solve problems, I realized how easy it was for me to spot them, but to find the solutions, or what was good and what was working and what I could appreciate. Luckily, I think that it helped me as a parent, because I was less critical and much more encouraging and appreciative too. So, these are just some of the games I played with myself. I also had a game of 3. I loved to give advice. Apparently. And people didn't want my advice. They wanted my wisdom, which for me, I was like, what the heck does that mean? But so the game of 3 was, when you came to my office, I had 3 questions for you first. Because what I was trying to do is, so why were you here? So what are you thinking? And so now I would say the big 3 are, what are you thinking? What are you feeling about that? And ideally, what do you need or want? Or I would say, what's on your mind? What do you think about that? And what do you believe the ideal outcome of that problem or that plan might look like? And then the $1 million question for me was, how can I help?
How did you keep these frameworks front and center then? Because I could see in the heat of the moment that someone comes into your office, you're busy doing something, you have your best intentions, and then they leave the office and you're like, oh, I forgot the game of 3. How did you develop this habit so that you were able to stick to it?
Well, there's 2 things. So as the WAIT thing was stickies all over my office, and people come in, why do you have WAIT all over your walls? And I would have to tell them, this is what I'm doing. This is what I'm learning. So there was an accountability in sharing the game. With this team that had actually, made me aware that I was a problem and gave too much advice. This is what I said to them. When you come in to my office if I don't ask you 3 questions, or you don't come ready to go, Judy, here's the problem I want to solve. Here's what I think about it. Here's ideally what I want to get out of. And here's how I've come to that thing. And this is how I need. So I said, either you're coming into my office telling me what role you want me to play to help you move from problem to plan, or I'm asking you questions. But I said, I need you to stop me when the advice train starts. And so there was an accountability. So this was a partnership. Like, these people helped me change me. And as a coach now with leaders, we look at what are the systems you need to put in place so that you can practice the skills that are either going to shift the mindset or the behavior that we're trying to change or grow. And so it's really about the systems. I think we measure, and like I said, I made them games, and I still game myself. I look at things, okay, what do I want to get better at? And how do I turn that into a 30-day challenge or a 30-day game?
Yeah, so you're making learning fun. And that's, Adam Grant just launched a new book called Hidden Potential, and he talks a lot about that, like the evidence of reaching our potential. A lot of times is, how do you make learning and personal growth enjoyable and fun and make it into a game? And it sounds like you did a wonderful job of that. But there's another concept I think that you're describing here. So you first and foremost took personal responsibility and came up with some clever ways to work on yourself. You alluded to it, but I wonder if we could deliberately talk about it, this notion of your support network, or like the scaffolding around you. How did you engage your most trusted colleagues to help support you on this sort of journey of personal growth?
So in that early days, obviously the team that had the courage to tell me that my behavior as a leader wasn't working for them, they were a big part of that game plan. But obviously, as I left the organization, as I moved forward, I feel very lucky about the mentors I've had. I've had a coach for myself, so I'm a coach, but I have a coach, and so I'm always going, how am I upping my game? And the other thing I do is I do quite a bit of reflective thinking every day, and looking and thinking about what's the energy I'm bringing into a conversation. And so I often say to leaders, like I'm a simplifier. I say, I think the essence of leadership now is setting direction, taking other people with you, and doing the right thing. And I think actually the things that help us do that, first is to build trust, like deep trust. Second is to build a team or an organizational or a group identity, like who are we and why, what's our purpose, and how do we do things around here? And the third thing is around this idea of building a feedback-rich environment. And I think that's what most leaders are starved of, is a community of people who care enough to tell you the kind truth. And so you either pay for that or you build it. And I think that when we have multi-levels of that and we give permission to people, hey, if I'm going to get better, I can't see how I land with you. So I mean, even with all my clients, at the end of a call or a program, like, what was the value for you today? What are you leaving from this conversation? What did you learn? And that's how I'm always also building in systems around my work, whether it's a workshop, whether it's a keynote, whether it's one-on-one coaching or team coaching. What was the value? What are we going to do as a function, as a result of that? Or how was this helpful? And if it wasn't helpful, that's also important for me to know. And so feedback sort of has become this richness. And, I go back to some work by Sean Aker in his book, Small Potential. One of my favorite quotes from that book was, small potential is believing we can be great alone. And big potential is realizing that we're better together. And now that I work in high performance sport, I mean, there's not one athlete in our Olympic and Paralympic system who becomes great and hits the podium all by themselves. Yeah, and I think leaders need to start looking at themselves as athletes in that way around who's your coach, who helps you recover, when do you rest, when do you, all those kinds of things. Yeah. Sorry, we went all over the place, but I hope
it's good, Judy. No, it's good. It's good, Judy. You're planting like all of these seeds of directions that we could go with this. I mean, first of all, I love that you're a simplifier. That resonates for us. That's one of our core values: is simplicity is genius. So that'll resonate. That'll certainly resonate with our listeners. Yeah, and it reminds me of the quote: "If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together." That type of a thing. Now, you mentioned 3 things around leadership in terms of like setting the direction, and then building like the purpose and the trust, and then creating a feedback-rich environment. And I think most people understand that, But I think the scariest of those three is the last one. And there's this big knowing doing gap, I think, where leaders are more aware than ever that they have to seek out feedback. But I think it's really scary for people to get started. And I think it takes a lot of courage to overcome that barrier. And once you do it, you get a little bit of exposure therapy and it becomes easier over time. But what advice do you have for leaders that are scared to take that first step? They really want to be the best version of themselves, but they just can't get over their own fear of what they might find out on the other side, kind of like what you found out through that 360.
So one of my favorite questions when I start working with people or when they come up against themselves is, what are you willing to do? So you might know what you want to do, but what are you willing to do? And where's the first, what's the next best move that you can take? And then we can celebrate. Because, we don't think our way into a new way of being. We act our way into that. And I think actually that is the most important thing we can start to do in terms of building our emotional intelligence and building the conditions in which we can be good. But ideally, how do we create conditions to be great or world class or whatever your excellence words might be? But often I say to people is, get out from behind yourself. And, as much as, we're in that article from HBR around sapient leadership, it's like humility, authenticity, and vulnerability. Well, those are three words that scare quite a few of us, myself included. And so unless we start practicing who that person is or starting to test drive, we can't get through fear. And I look at, from my experiences, our two oldest emotions from the reading I've done are fear and love. And fear is the emotion that's messaged to me as I feel threatened, physically, socially, emotionally, and relationally. And it's part of our survival strategy, right? We need social connection like we need water and food. And yet fear actually can drive the bus so much more. And love is the emotion of connection. It's also a survival emotion to us. And so one of the things we have to get over or through is the fear. And what's the connection I can create to another person in a way that I'm willing to test it out? And so sometimes this is the game I play with my clients is, what are you willing to do? And let's create some tests. Let's test our assumption that we are going to be seen as weak, not so great. And so we test those assumptions because we surface the beliefs or the fears that are getting in the way. And then, hey, guess what? We're building self-awareness, which is the foundation of emotional intelligence.
Yes. I want to come back, Judy. You suggested that EQ kind of is comprised of three main elements. It's the self-awareness, the other awareness, and then the team or together, the togetherness piece. I think you shared some tactics on the sort of the self-awareness piece, but I wondered if you would share some tactics on building other awareness and what that looks like.
Okay. I'm getting a steady diet of Judaisms today. So, I talk often, and I spent the last 2 days with a bunch of entrepreneurs talking about this idea of, as founders around an idea, what's easy is to be right and to know it all. I said, what's difficult as you bring on team members and others is to get curious. And so I talk often about, are you the king and queen of all the answers, or are you the king and queen of the best questions? And so much of what I think it lies behind empathy and other awareness is the quality of the questions we ask, how deep we're willing to listen to understand, and then how we use feedback, not only receiving it, but giving it in a way that it moves the conversation forward. So, so we end up kind of unpacking other awareness through the lens of what makes a quality question, how do you listen deeper, and how do you actually give and receive feedback that both of you get better? So to me, other awareness is really those three skills with ourselves and with others. And if I could, that's how I kind of boiled this vast ocean of leadership and emotional intelligence. Said if you just got really good at these three, you'd significantly shift conversations.
Yeah, I find it helpful to think towards my future self and what's my future self going to regret less or be more thankful for. And it's almost like this concept of resume values or eulogy virtues type of a thing. And it's like, here lies a person that had all the answers, or here lies a person that made other people better. I certainly know where most people would choose on that continuum, Judy. If you were observing an emotionally intelligent leader when it comes to other awareness, like what would you be seeing in those leaders in terms of the frequency of conversations, how they would be conducting them, anything else that comes to mind?
So the metaphor or the analogy I tend to use when I'm saying, here's what I'm going to look for, are your conversations like a dance. Sometimes you're leading, sometimes you're following, but they flow. Versus a wrestling match where somebody has to win and someone has to lose. And that's what I just think that's what you see. Because when you think about, like, if you've ever watched Incredible Dancers, I'm not one of them, but there is this idea of leadership and followership happening in that moment. And I think that great emotionally intelligent leaders know when to lead or offer their point of view or ask a question, and they know when to follow, which is sort of like encourage, input, listen, ask another question, go deeper. And then there's this flow. And it's a pretty amazing thing to watch, because what happens then is you have this deep resonance happening between two people. Their brains are connected. Their body language and tone of voice seems to be sort of in this frame of place. And so it's flowing. And I look for that. I watch teams. I watch people. It's kind of my nerd out moment, but you start to see where are people leaning in, and which means they're feeling safe, or that they're trusting this process, or where are they leaning out, which their brain is saying, alert, this is a bit threatening, doesn't feel so safe. I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, it does. And because you're observing so many teams in the wild, it just makes me curious about what usually trips teams up as they're trying to use this. Because I think of the analogy of a bicycle, like that anytime you're learning something worthwhile, it's worth being bad at it for a long time. So when they're going through this growth phase and being bad at it, what are some of the common sort of hangups or things that will get in the way as teams are trying to make progress?
Oh gosh, there's a long list. So a couple things. If the team hasn't invested in knowing each other beyond their titles and their functional or technical knowledge, right? So if we don't actually know some stuff about each other, so when trust isn't there, we talk about trust as often, or we have communication issue, we say quite often. And I'm like, no, actually, this is just really a know each other issue. How well do we know each other? And I think that trips up our teams often enough, is we get so focused on being right that we haven't actually explored what does getting it right for us as a team look like at the end of the year. What do we want to say we've accomplished together? Knowing that, individually, we all have our roles and responsibilities and different decision rights. But the question I always ask teams is, what's your role? What business are you in, and what are you 100% responsible for as this group? Because I think for all of us individually, it's easy to go, here's what I'm responsible for. But not sure we ever ask that question in teams. And so it goes back to humility, authenticity, and vulnerability as the foundation of building trust. It's a verb, and we have to cultivate it. It's like planting trust in a garden and watering it, and is checking in all the time. Are my words and actions with you, my peer, and in this team, are we building trust? Are they deposits in the bank of trust? Or are we making withdrawals and not being able to be candid and let each other know about that? Or dig deeper. What do you mean when you say that? And here's the concern I have about this decision we're making. Have we thought through this impact? Those are the kinds of dance conversations that need to be happening in the boardrooms, I believe, more so than ever. The more candor and the more clarity we can sort of put again, it goes back to, what are you thinking? What are you feeling? What do you want? If all of that was just the stuff that started every meeting with this, where's everybody at on this issue, this problem, or this opportunity? I think our commercial conversations would be so much easier and so much better.
And your analogy of a wrestling match or dancing together, that really resonates. And I can think of probably almost to a T. My favorite meetings feel like a dance. My least favorite meetings feel like I was in some kind of a conflict or competition to maybe not get the last word, but to sort of dictate the terms of the discussion, and not really being open to what was being said and what other people had to offer. One of the things around vulnerability, Judy, is I think we're slowly learning that vulnerability doesn't have to mean that you share your deepest, darkest secrets and all the things going on in your home life. But I still see a dynamic that's challenging is because there are varying degrees of comfort with vulnerability. You'll have people that are very comfortable, and oftentimes they've worked together for a long time, and then new people join the team. So not only are they new, but sometimes they just have a very different relationship with sharing anything about their personal lives. How do folks that are very uncomfortable sharing about themselves with folks that are very comfortable sharing about themselves meet in the middle to create cohesiveness?
Great question. Oftentimes when I talk, we talk about this idea of vulnerability or even empathy, people kind of have, something, or, we even talk about, I got to share about my personal life. Sometimes I just like, what if we just had cognitive vulnerability, intellectual vulnerability? Here's what I know. Here's what I don't know. Here's what I'm wondering. Here's what I'd love to ask. Here's what I don't understand. I think those conversations are vulnerable conversations for very smart people and high performance individuals. And to me, that's actually a really important place to be. So over time, when that becomes safer for me, I may offer up more about my personal life or more about who I am outside of work, or just the stuff that, makes me tick. But I just think if we got really simple around here's what I know, here's what I don't know, here's what I'm wondering, here's a question I have for you, and the reason I'm asking is because of this. Like, those to me are important, vulnerable conversations that just really allow us to surface where we're starting from.
I think that's helpful. Well, I think that's
does that help?
It does, helps a lot, and I think it's helpful for individuals that are maybe that know they struggle with vulnerability and what they think it means. I think you change the definition a bit, but I think where it's also helpful, Judy, is to help managers and leaders start recognizing behaviors they never categorized as vulnerability, so they can spotlight that a little bit and provide some feedback to employees when they are showing some vulnerability that probably was more courageous than someone that is really vulnerable would see and would register.
I mean, one of the easiest ways, and I've borrowed this exercise from Dr. Brené Brown, and is this idea of, a bank of trust, right? And so often when we talk about trust, people say, I'll ask, are you somebody who trusts until someone proves they're not trustworthy? Or are you somebody who needs to be proven that someone is worthy of trusting? And I said, if you think about kind of those frames around trust, what is really happening is we're focused our brain and our attention on finding the proof. So we're looking to catch people's behavior that say this person is not trustworthy. However, most of us would say we are. And so the exercise I always sort of say to people, if you had a bank of trust and it was really about defining the behaviors, and this is hard for people, and it's important for teams, is what are the behaviors that are okay, that build trust? Those are the deposits. What are the behaviors that are not okay, that erode trust? And I think that behavioral focus makes it less about me judging you. It's being able to go, hey, when you say or do that, I'm okay with that. I really appreciate it. Or I'm not okay with it, or I'm not understanding it. Unpack that for me.
Yeah.
So when we make it a behavioral problem issue or a behavioral norms, or we define the behaviors on this team that are okay or not okay, that will help us come together and trust each other more and be able to share our experience, our expertise, and over time, the essence of who we are. I think then most of the problems we deal with, or the drama in our organization, stop being who problems, they become what problems.
Right. Yeah, I can see that for sure. And in our organization and some of the work that we do with clients as well, anytime we know that we're going into some kind of a vulnerable conversation, we will give some examples of what vulnerability is and isn't, and try to demystify some of that stuff. And I think it helps at least a little bit, even going to the lengths of saying, just telling the group that you're not comfortable, you don't share your personal life with colleagues. That is in itself authentic, and it is vulnerable. And I think some of those things change the rule, and so everybody can meaningfully participate when we're working off sort of the same set of expectations. Judy, we may have talked about it enough, but I want to make sure, just in case, that we don't skip over it. So the third area was this notion of like team awareness or togetherness. Did we talk enough about that piece, or were there some tactics or some things that you maybe wanted to share about that third sort of category or realm of EQ?
I'm still going to come back to this idea that if we got better at asking questions, listening longer to understand, and be able to give each other feedback that was moving us forward or helpful, not hurtful, versus the criticism we tend to wrap around that. I think in the team dynamic, we start to then, over time, minimize the drama, make conflict healthier versus, around personal attacks or false harmony is what we see. So I still think those three skills help us. And then as you get better at them and you do it collectively, then I think the conversation can get richer and we're clear on, expectations, right? Because we're clear on what our expectations are of each other. We've come to some agreement around what that is. We can talk about what results we're trying to achieve and what are the barriers or the challenges we're going to get going from where we are now to where we want to be. And we can start to talk about when people get stressed or not in their best moment and they start to behave in ways that they may or may not be aware of. And this is, some of the emotional intelligence. We can with curiosity, hopefully say, I'm noticing you're irritated and frustrated. Unpack that for me. Mm-hmm. So those three skills still, I think, live in all three. How do I know myself? How do I get, curious about you? But then how do we start to actually then put all this experience and expertise that are here to run a business, run a team, or whatever else to work with it? How do we maximize the use of all that? And I think curiosity, listening to understand, and a feedback-rich environment is going to allow us to have that kind of breakthrough thinking that I think we need more than ever. I don't know. I'm so tired of the 2023 conversation around busy and burnout. And I just want 2024 to be, what are the breakthroughs individually and collectively that we need to have? So things actually feel like they're moving forward.
Well, and speaking about 2023 being a year of, burnout and overwhelm, I had the great pleasure of going through the WeQ profile process with you back in May. And I'm not going to bore listeners with all of the details, but it was also a very sobering look at my own life. It wasn't a 360, so there's nothing in here that says my colleagues think that I'm a dick, but they may. That's to come. That's to come later. But one of the things, Judy, that you said in our debrief was that oftentimes it is our most important relationships that are the most triggering. How come?
Okay, how do I answer this simply versus rambling? So, the more important the relationships are in our lives. So we decide who those are. It could be our families. It could be certain people in our groups. But because we're hardwired, I go back to fear and love, which is safety and belonging. And so when we are in relationships that get tense or struggle, we learn coping mechanisms to stay connected to the people that matter the most to us. And so when we are in conflict or being challenged in those relationships that matter to us, we may find ourselves doing things to minimize what feels risky to us on the inside. Like when if I go all the way back to that time where my team's telling me that they quietly called me or Dick, short for dictator, I can go back and look at that so this was a team I built, put together, and was incredibly proud of the work we were doing. And we were doing some pretty important, I'd say bold things to move the organization forward on a people side. But I think when I got stressed, I would fear I didn't look as good. I wasn't smart enough. Like all that stuff that was my stuff turned into behaviors that were more controlling, more critical, and less caring. And I think that's what happens is when we're not aware of how we are under stress or pressure and sort of the inside out stuff and the beliefs or the stories we tell ourselves, then in the relationships that matter a lot to us, we can be sometimes not our best and then not know how to repair from that well enough either. And I think as leaders, because we're being watched all the time, I think it's important for us to understand what are the things that are going to, trigger certain thoughts or behaviors. And am I okay with that? And if I'm not, what are the things or the rituals, routines, or systems I can put in play to ensure that I'm managing that in the moment? Because emotional intelligence is not about kind of being perfect. It's actually being more responsive and real than reactive.
You touched on something there around like our best self and our worst self. We're not supposed to be perfect. When stress is low and our workload is manageable, it's Friday afternoon, it's easy to be patient and tolerant and curious, but it's when work is bearing down on us and there's pressure from home and pressure at work and other challenges that people might be dealing with, it is hard in the moment when you get triggered to emotionally regulate. And and I think like the ability to emotionally regulate in the moment, Judy, is like a meta skill. And maybe I think that because it's just so difficult for me to do it. And it's probably like the number one thing I'm working on in my life right now. But how do people get better at emotionally regulating when the temperature is rising in the moment and not letting that blow up catastrophically?
So I'm going to go back to my weight idea. What am I thinking? And so for many of us, our emotional literacy, our ability to name and notice our emotions is not something we learned how to do. I certainly didn't. I mean, way back when you asked me how I was feeling and I tell you what I thought, because I thought there was no place in leadership or even really in my life for feelings. The science of emotion that continues to merge for me is quite fascinating. But I think the first step to emotionally regulating is starting to actually pay more attention to our thoughts. And for many of us, and the meta skill that you're talking about is this becoming more cognitively aware of which thoughts are useful right now and which ones are not. Because if my thinking is in conflict with, if you and I were having a disagreement, Jeff, around an issue, and all I can think is more judgmental thoughts about myself and you. Either, Jeff must think I'm stupid and why can't I get my point across? And I might be having the ticker tape in my head going, why can't I get this across to him in a way he understands? And I might also be saying, why is he being so aggressive with his point of view? Well, if that's where my thought is, there's no curiosity. My ability to form a question and my ability to stay present and listen to try and understand isn't there. And so part of the process is starting to realize our thoughts are not who we are. They're just they're part of, they're things we need to pay attention to. And I think that's part of the process that was early days for me is where am I thinking and what am I thinking?
Yeah.
Because where my thoughts are, I can start to then understand, is there a just distressing emotion behind that? Or one that's actually more empowering or that builds my confidence. And, we have way more distressing emotions than we do positive ones, which is why we have to start to pay attention to our thoughts. Are we choosing helpful ones or not? Because I think, the more I want to sit in dark, negative, distressing thoughts, you can imagine the emotional soup that's going along with that. And I like to say the more negative or distressing my thinking is, the narrower my perspective on the problem, either for myself or with others. It's almost like you get blinders on, because what you're doing is you're trying to manage the conversation, or get out of it or be right and win it. Like, this is where the wrestling match comes in.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Judy. And I want to offer up a couple of personal experiences recently. And this is right around the time where you and I had the debrief conversation back in May, as I noticed the power of boundaries. And when I know that I'm maybe a little bit overwhelmed, maybe a little bit more stressed than I would like to be, having some boundaries around when I answer phone calls, when I respond to emails, when I'm available, I know there's a direct correlation with not making myself as accessible. And I know, depending on your job and your role and what's going on, like sometimes you don't have the luxury of being inaccessible for a period of time, but there'll be a piece there. But I also learned a powerful part about other people setting boundaries and helping other people be the best version of themselves. I had an uncomfortable conversation with a colleague. I just finished driving to Calgary and I was parked in traffic and I shouldn't have been on the phone with her, but we got into a bit of a heated argument and I was not talking to her in a very respectful manner. And she called me out on it in the moment. And she called me out, and I immediately paused because I care about her so much. And I actually got emotional because I was so ashamed about the way I was speaking to her. And because she had such strong boundaries, I was able to catch myself, apologize to her, and we recovered in the moment, which doesn't always happen. But I don't think I realized the power that it can have on other people being a better version of themselves if you just can start setting better boundaries yourself. And I wonder if you've seen that show up in some of the work that you've done.
So, you've just quickly, like we've talked about the EQ profile, and it's an interesting tool because it actually ties into our neurobiology, and it gives us a map of ourselves from the inside out when we're under stress, under pressure. And so there's 7 different measures we look, and so the conversation around boundaries always shows up for leaders in sort of looking at themselves under pressure, under stress, or when am I at my best energy, when am I not, and boundaries being what's okay, what's not okay, or what are the places and spaces where I can bring the best version of myself or my best energy. Those become thoughtful choices so that I'm setting myself up to not drop into my profile as I say it, but I actually get to rise above it. So the more aware I am of the things that cause me to go down a certain thinking path or behavior path are the same ones that allow me to do what you just did, which was almost a do-over. Like somebody catches you in a space that says, hey, Jeff, this is not okay. Or you're not, I'm really not happy with how you've been talking to me. Well, there's a bunch of stuff that comes up even in that whole scenario for me. There's clearly a level of trust and respect that has been navigated and negotiated between you and this person. There's an appreciation that by the nature of our work or the work that we do together, we're not always going to disagree, and we've made that okay. But there's a level of understanding and commitment to, even when it's hard, we're not going to actually turn our back and not say anything. I'm going to say to you, Jeff, that wasn't your best. And the fact that from an emotionally intelligent standpoint, you can sit there and you go, you're right. I'm going to own that. And I'm going to apologize. And to me, that is an amazing example of it's not always going to be perfect. But if I can own my part, because every relationship takes 2, and I don't blame or shame or criticize or judge. I just go, yeah, I need a do-over, or I apologize. That's not going to happen again. Thank you for making me aware. And I think that's the piece. None of us get up in the morning and put on a GoPro, go about our day, and then sort of download and go, hey, how should I show up today? We don't see that. Because I think what's so interesting is we judge people by their behavior, but we judge ourselves by our intention. And so when we start to have people in our lives mirror or show for us what behaviors that we do that they absolutely love and adore, and they tell us often, we'll repeat them because you know what? We want to feel like we're doing good work. But if we also build that space where when, like you did with your colleague, that wasn't your best, I just think to me, that's just, you painted a great picture of what emotional intelligence in action really looks like. Yeah. Because the dance was happening and then it turned into a wrestling match. And then somebody said, let's stop, reset, and let's start dancing again. And that's kind of what your scenario says to me. And that to me is a great example of emotional intelligence teamwork. Because somewhere in the mix of things, one person went, whoa, this is not okay for me and it's not okay for you. And that was the together awareness, is let's reset and let's restart, or let's reimagine how this could work.
Yeah, no, that's good. And it just reminds me how lucky I am to work with such great colleagues. And I know we've touched on it in this example, but I did have another question I still want to ask you is, how do emotionally intelligent leaders repair damage? So they know they've screwed up, they made an error, didn't show up as their best version of themselves. Is there a bit of a playbook that you ever offer up to folks to say, all right, here's how you come back and own it and try to repair it?
So, I'll kind of come at this from a couple of different angles. So what repairs it for me may not repair it for you. And so I actually think one of the most important things I can ask is, how do I make this right? Like, I can apologize and I can say, I will not do that again. Obviously I have to sort of, walk that talk, right? But I think sometimes for people is, what's it going to take for me to make this right? And for some people, depending on kind of their lived and learned experience, an apology is all they need. And then, you don't repeat that behavior. For others, it's going to take longer. And I think that's the vulnerable space that's hard for a lot of us to go to, especially when our apology isn't enough. So I don't know if there's exactly a playbook, but What will repair it for me might not repair it for you. And if I'm curious, compassionate, and enough to ask the question is, how do we make this right? Or how do we make this better? Or can I have a do-over? I mean, that's language I use often, especially with my young adult children. Can I have a do-over? Because that really wasn't my best.
Yeah.
And I've done it with clients too. You know what? I'm not happy with how that unfolded. Can I have a do-over? And the do-over meaning, here's what I wish I'd said. Would that have helped? Or what does better look like going forward? And I think that's the conversation that's keeps us out of blame and keeps us in a learning space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this conversation has also made me reflect on probably the best way to repair some damage is the work that you do before damage is caused. And you alluded to that in the example that I shared, but I think it's almost that trust account that you build up with folks. Hopefully more days than not, you're making deposits and not withdrawals. I think that's also a big piece. Now, Judy, I wanted to reference here too. I mean, when you and I did the WeQ profile, there were some things that came out of there. I mean, some really positive things, but there were also some
very much so.
There were some concerning things in terms of, you had some concerns actually about my health. If I continued on the path I was on, and that was a period where I probably was as busy as I've ever been in my life, and I was putting a lot of pressure on myself at work, and so I'm not surprised that it showed up that way. But the thing that I would love to give listeners here is sort of a last piece of this conversation. It is not easy when you're under the burden of all of that pressure, duress, and stress, and you feel like everything is mounting up. How do you start to climb your way out of that cave, I guess, or that hole? Like that's all I can describe it as, is it feels like a hole, and it seems almost impossible to get your way out of it. But what are some simple steps? Like if somebody is listening to this conversation and they're just feeling incredibly overwhelmed, how do they start to just take a small step towards some semblance of gaining back some mental health and some stability?
So, context, just to add it before I get into the kind of, here's what I would offer. I think the last number of years have been incredibly difficult for leaders. And I think we've been overgiving to everybody else in the service of our business and our staff and everything, and undergiving to ourselves. And over the last number of years, I've gone back to some pretty important work from Jeffrey Schwartz around managing our energy. So rather than us going, how do I do this from a time or attention? I say, where's your energy? And I sort of say, I always give people the analogy of a gas tank, where, if you're a car, where's your gas tank? And is the light on? And so where do you need to refuel, and what's going to refuel you? And so I get people thinking about this idea of, do I just need more sleep? Is it movement? Is it people? Is it places? But if there's one thing I'm seeing is more and more in this tool, it measures our access to 7 emotions. And the one that tells me that people's gas tank is empty is the one called joy. And the emotional family of joy, the message is, it is how confident do I feel in this moment? And the value of it is also just how brave and bold and kind of self-care, like how full is my gas tank? And so for me, we tend to think of self-care or building out of the overwhelm as having to be this big, huge thing. And that in of itself can feel overwhelming for people. I go back to what is one thing you'd be willing to do that would fuel you? Yeah. And I just think we have to start small, because we didn't get to burnout like immediately. It was a series of small choices and decisions about giving everybody else what they needed and not giving ourselves it. That I also believe that the journey out of that hole has to be somewhat of a game, but it also has to be a very intentional plan for me first. Because as I often say to people, every single one of us is a combination of all of our experience, personal and professional, all of our expertise, all the skills and knowledge we have accumulated, and our energy. And I think that the only way we get our brilliance into the world is through our energy. And so if you're noticing your gas tank empty, it's time to start to reset and fuel yourself one day, 1 hour, 1 week at a time, and start to actually Because the analogy I use is much like in my car when my gas tank is empty. From an emotional intelligence standpoint, when my gas light goes on, I'm looking for the fastest way to the gas station or the fastest way to get where I need to go. And so things like, traffic and detours and construction and Sunday drivers, those things are going to go get me irritated, frustrated, annoyed, and overreactive. And so the same thing with our behavior, right? So I have to think of how fueled is my car? Am I a high performance vehicle, or am I sort of this, thing that's barely making it down the road? And I think this is the energy we've got to take care of, because we didn't get to where we are in our roles as leaders with little energy. It was our energy that allowed us to create great teams, great businesses, and great lives. And so when we notice our bank account or our tank empty, it's time to pause and reset.
And much like you said, it's a series of small decisions and choices that emptied our gas tank in the first place. Maybe it's encouraging to hear that it's then a small set of decisions and choices that can help sort of get us out of that. So that's helpful, Judy. There are so many different pieces of this conversation I found helpful. And Judy, what I hope is you've shared a lot of different tips and tactics and some frameworks, and is that folks that are listening into this conversation are then going to be curious enough to want to go learn more about EQ and how it can benefit themselves. And I wondered if you could share with the audience how they can best find you if they want to chat with you directly.
Okay, well, you can find me on LinkedIn, or you can tap into my website, judyriege.com, and send me a note. And that's probably the easiest and fastest way is Judy Riege, Riege. Sign up for my newsletter. I continue to actually write every week about the leadership lessons I'm learning as I continue to be a work in progress on my own EQ. Or what I'm learning is I help teams and leaders have breakthrough moments around how they're showing up and how their best today actually can get better. And that we can truly sort of lead from a place of learning and love, if I can say that, versus fear and control.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And you're writing a book. When can we expect that book?
I'm setting myself the target to launch it in Q4 of 2024. So it will be my focus on kind of what I see that we need for everyday leadership everywhere. So it's a manifesto for us all to start to become role models for ourselves, for each other, and for the next generation.
Well, good luck with that, and I can't wait to read it, and certainly look forward to some of the conversations that you and I have coming up in the new year. Judy, such a pleasure to chat with you today. Thank you for making time and sharing just some snippets of your vast insight and your depth of knowledge with us. I'm so glad that you got that feedback 20 years ago about being a dictator, because if not, we wouldn't have been here today, and the thousands of people that you have impacted on this journey. I mean, what a wonderful gift that colleague gave you, and thank you for your vulnerability and for sharing that with us today. So delighted to speak with you. So thank you for being here.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. This was fun.
And for all of our listeners, it's great to have you here. Thanks for listening and tuning in. And just never forget the immense impact that you can have on somebody else's life when you just take the time to think about how you impact their world based on how you show up at work every day. Until then, be well, everyone, and we'll see you again next time. If you enjoyed this episode and found it helpful, don't forget to give us a 5-star rating and subscribe to our YouTube channel or wherever your favorite podcasts are found. And if you're part of a leadership team and you just know that your organization is capable of even better performance, please reach out to us at unleashresults.com for a conversation and to learn more about how we might help unleash the potential of your team and organization.